Welcome to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Earlier this week, we got into Walz as potential VP and the enthusiasm within the Democratic Party. Today, we are here with a bonus episode where we jump across the aisle and talk about the former President Donald Trump and vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. We're going to start by breaking down the campaign's recent rally in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and how the matchup is looking right here in our backyard. Next, we will break down the state of politics today and follow up on a little of the Walz commentary as things evolve this week. We will then get into Trump's comments on Kamala Harris's race this week during a panel hosted by the National Association of Black Journalists. We will keep our theme of harmful comments by the Republican ticket by breaking down the ridiculous statements about childless women and subsequent quote-unquote apology by J.D. Vance. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. President Trump and J.D. Vance were in Minnesota, came back for their second rally of the year. They were in St. Cloud on Saturday, July 27th. A little over 8,000 people inside, almost 10,000 people plus waited outside in 90-degree heat to get into one of the first Trump rallies after the assassination attempt and after the announcement of Vance as the running mate. Your thoughts? Anything big notable that came out of that to you, or it was pretty same old?
Look, I was not at the event. Were you at the event?
I was not.
I did not go to the event. I watched it from out of state. I was in Iowa and I watched the event. Let me just say this. First of all, a lot of enthusiasm at the event. St. Cloud, I think it reinforces the narrative that there was a belief at some point that Minnesota was on the radar map for the Trump campaign. And so interesting to see both J.D. Vance, United States Senator from Ohio, and Trump both here at the same time. I don't know to what degree they'll come back, but it was from an enthusiasm standpoint, by all accounts, vibrant crowd, good turnout, and the Trump campaign is back in Minnesota. I'd like to get your thoughts on how long that lasts, but that's the best commentary that I could describe an event that I wasn't at and wouldn't have gone if someone paid me to go.
I wouldn't be surprised if we saw them again, one of the two of them. I don't think likely two of them together. That's a lot of political capital to put in one place at the same time. I was surprised we got both of them. I think originally we had heard it was going to be Vance, and then Trump did get added a couple days prior. I do think that it's certainly one. I think Minnesota is going to remain on the Trump's list of probably top tier 2, right? Like they've got the top tier battleground states that they need to win. I think also here in Minnesota, coverage does lean over into Wisconsin, which is a state that needs to continue and play for the Trump campaign. And so I think there is some benefit there. I know that there's also, we've been talking a lot about kind of the teamwork side of the Trump campaign. And Tom Emmer, Republican leader in Congress, obviously from Minnesota, St. Cloud is in the 6th congressional district, which Emmer represents. Emmer was on stage. Trump mentioned him 5 or 6 times throughout his speech, saying Tom or pointing to him, nodding to him. So I definitely think that is something to it as well. I think this is making sure that we're all one big happy family, playing nice and doing that. I do think though, Minnesota, let's chat about the recent poll. KSTP came out with a poll July 26th. First poll since Harris was made the nominee. Harris is up over Trump by 10. It's 50-40. This is an increase from where it was previously under Biden. Under Biden, it was 47-41. She has gained some points. It should be noted that the poll says it was 42% Democratic voters and 37% GOP. So there is a split of 4 there. But anyways, Harris is up effectively by 10 right now, has made major inroads with women in the state, 7 points higher than Biden, 5 points higher than Biden was on an independence. So I find it really hard to believe that this is going to be the first year in some 40, 50 years that Republicans turn Minnesota red for President Trump. But crazier things have happened.
I think the poll is a reflection of what I heard from Republicans after Biden got out, which is that this was going to change the dynamic in Minnesota quite a bit. And I don't think Trump has done anything to improve his standing in the state of Minnesota. And in fact, I think, which we can get into more in the next subject, but I think Minnesota is largely off the map. And I think it shows, I think, something that we discussed with Will discuss that how Republicans could win the state is paraphrasing a bit, but there needs to be apathy a little bit at the top of the ticket, that Republicans don't necessarily win, but Democrats kind of need to lose. And I think the proximity of the race between Biden and Trump was exactly as we described it and fits in historically, which is that there was frustration, there was an enthusiasm gap between what Republicans were feeling for Trump in a sense that Republicans were incredibly unified and enthusiastic. Some Republicans were, not me, but Republicans were for voting for Trump. And there was an enthusiasm gap between Biden and Trump. You remove Biden from the equation, and the enthusiasm gap is closed. Democrats are very enthusiastic right now about about Vice President Harris's rising and becoming the nominee. And so I don't know how much longer even Trump's campaign will consider Minnesota to be on the map. I think a lot of the VP stakes, which we can get to later in the show, will have some impact on that. Just a couple things I want to say about Trump's appearance here, and regarding the poll, and in particular, I was surprised. Let's say a couple things. We've done a couple shows in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on Trump. I watched his speech at the national convention, and I am not a Trump supporter. Didn't vote for him in 16, 20, didn't vote for him this year, and I didn't vote for him in the presidential primary. I won't be voting for him again this time around. I was very curious how the near death experience that he had, where he was almost killed at a presidential rally, would change him in terms of who he is as a presidential candidate. And what is surprising to me is that Trump's political standing, let me just be callous, that he didn't get more of a poll bump out of nearly getting killed. I don't know other way to say it. Again, I'm not a Trump supporter, didn't vote for him, and I hope he doesn't win the election. But he's a human being. And
Mhm.
it's something that we've talked about before particularly with Shannon Watson, about kind of the dehumanization of politics. But the reality is, I think that Donald Trump is not a very popular candidate. And his high water mark, this is someone who got 46.8% of the vote in 2020. He's never been a 51% candidate, certainly not in Minnesota. He's unpopular. And I think the best indication of how unpopular Donald Trump is as a person is he almost lost his life, and his polls have largely gone down. And I am surprised by that. And I really want to caution and temper my remarks. One of the things, Becky, I so enjoy about our podcast is we can have people on who are like MAGA people. We can have Democrats on who are opposite of MAGA. And then I think you and I fall in some ways in that center. And we've always been responsible with our rhetoric about the former president. We certainly didn't call him America's Hitler like JD Vance did, or use some of that language as JD Vance used to describe. I've never spoken to him or said words like the JD Vance has said about Donald Trump. I am very surprised. I shouldn't say surprised. I think it's something of note that Donald Trump nearly lost his life, was nearly assassinated, and the race, it's largely been forgotten because I think Donald Trump, for a variety of reasons, I think it's largely been forgotten. And one of them, I think, sadly, is that Donald Trump is so unpopular, and honestly, that makes me sad. I say that because I want people to humanize other people. I wish we could talk about our political leaders and politics was not as personal and as filled with such vitriol and hate. Donald Trump almost lost his life earlier last month. Came very close to losing his life. And I think in a normal political circumstance, someone like that could have been a huge boost in his poll numbers, but it hasn't been, because I think fundamentally there was a lot of people, I think, that paused. We're like, okay, let's see if this changes him. Let's see if this changes his rhetoric. I think if Donald Trump would have gone out and spoke at the national convention and given the first 30 minutes of his speech, I think we would be talking about an entirely different race right now. But I think Donald Trump normalized the race by going past those additional 30 minutes of his speech, going off script, and getting right back to who he was.
Mhm.
And it's unfortunate because I do think that Donald Trump nearly losing his life, there should be more of a pause collectively as a country. even though I'm not a Trump supporter, because he is a human being. The presidential race is moving forward and it's moving ahead. And Donald Trump has gotten no bump or any type of sizable boost out of nearly losing his life. And I'm not saying that as something to mock or make fun of. I'm bringing it up as just an observation. I just wanted to make sure was noted.
I think it's great to note. And I think it really does, if we look in and zoom in on what the last 2 to 3 weeks have really included, we had, was it Saturday, I think the 13th, that Trump, it was the assassination attempt on Trump. Then we went into the RNC convention. And then on Sunday, the 21st, Biden dropped out. And so I really think, I agree with you. I think that they did not play the speech at the RNC convention. We were told he tore up his script. We were expecting, I think, something to have been changed and to be different about the speech that we got. But I think when you dive into, again, the politics of politics and how the strategy of some, man, oh man, do we have to applaud the Biden team for making the decision to drop out when they did. They took all the wind out of the sails of the Republican side of things, because I think had that not happened on that date, had that happened prior or maybe a week later, I think things would be different. I think there would have been a little bit more momentum coming out of the RNC following the almost death of President Trump. And I do think things would look a little different. But instead, 8 days after this assassination attempt, Biden drops out, all attention shifts left. Then we have a couple of days of watching that and watching people pump up Harris, and then it become officially Harris. And now the Harris boost. And I really think that what a crazy difference 2 weeks of time can really make on something, because it's, and I think we should get into this a little bit more as we move forward, but I think Trump and the Trump campaign are a little lost at how to send their arrows towards Kamala. I think that they had a strategy of what they were going to do with Biden. They thought they knew what they were going to do with Harris. And I think Harris is responding relatively effectively, or at least bouncing back some of the attacks they're throwing on her. And I just really think they're just stumbling right now. And it'll be interesting to see when they catch their footing again.
Correct. The other thing I would say is Trump's statements in Minnesota. One of the things he discussed was he thinks he can win Minnesota as long as they don't cheat. I will say to you, we have had Secretary Steve Simon on our podcast. Hope to have him on again. I do think that I would have liked to have seen in the aftermath of Trump's departure from the state. I would have appreciated if there had been more pushback on some of those statements. There is a lot of misinformation out in the election cycle. And my concern is that, first of all, Donald Trump said he wasn't going to come back to Minnesota if he lost the state. He is still out there pushing this narrative that he thinks he may have won in 2020 here in Minnesota. And he's laying the groundwork to say that if he doesn't win, it's because of cheating. I really have to say, to the Republican aligned advocacy groups out there that are pushing election integrity and other stuff, now is the time in which to speak up, because Donald Trump is laying the seeds for there to be infighting that continues in this state about election integrity. And I think our Secretary of State, Steve Simon, is a very good ambassador for democracy and elections in this state. And I think there's obviously policing on both sides of Democrats and Republicans on matters related to election, but the Republican nominee for president came to this state and said and made the direct claim that he can win this state as long as they don't cheat. And he believes that he knows they won Minnesota in 2020. Donald Trump did not win in 16. He did not win in 20. I do not believe he's going to lose. He didn't win in 16. He didn't win in 20. And I don't believe he's going to win Minnesota in 2024. None of those elections that he lost in Minnesota were because of cheating. And I think that we've seen how this plays out. And I would call on the Republicans who are pushing election integrity and others to reassure Minnesotans and Republicans that we can have fair elections in this state, that we can have transparent elections in this state. And we need to stomp out the embers and the sparks that Donald Trump is starting to create here in some fires, because I think it's unfortunate and we know how this can end. And there needs to be more of a Republican effort to tamp down his remarks.
I completely agree. I think I would completely agree with all of that sentiment. I believe Joe Biden did win the election. I think we both stated that in the past, and that's certainly true. And yes, I think before the upcoming election, maybe when early voting comes, we'd love to have Secretary of State Steve Simon on to chat again about all things election integrity and all of that to make sure that folks have the utmost confidence in our election cycle. I want to move on to state of politics and throw it over to you to kick us off here.
I think we have an interesting state of the race here in Minnesota. And let's look back where we've discussed. In May, we had a pretty unique situation. And again, I'm not saying this to beat a dead horse. I just always want the listeners and people to be transparent. Not a Trump guy. Didn't vote for him in 16, didn't vote for him 20, not voting for him this time. But we had a really good discussion, I thought, with Kip Christensen and John Rouleau about the Trump event, how it was a unifying event, how it was a good rallying point. And the argument that I've made in the past, and there was some good pushback from all three of you, including you, about Trump not being much of a team player and him not being value added to the ticket. And I think that the selection of JD Vance and his comments afterwards and the ascension of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee has fundamentally changed this race. There's certain things that I think that Republicans can't control, but there are some things within their wheelhouse that they can do. And I think it's incumbent upon some of these Republicans, I think, to listen to where we're at now. Because in May, we were in a situation where KSTP, I think, had done a series of polls that showed that this was a neck and neck race. And that changed. And why did it change? Did it change just because of Harris? Did it change for other reasons? We're now in a situation where what we have right now is we also have as Republicans what they're looking at coming through to the August primary. Donald Trump is now behind. And I think Republicans need to be consistent about polling. They touted the KSTP numbers when they were released, and we did that. And I think you and I are both smart enough to know that polls are a snapshot in time and you have to evolve. And this race could absolutely tighten up. But where the race is right now in Minnesota is Donald Trump, if we want to look at poll to poll, is 10 points behind in this state. We also have a situation where we have the Republican endorsed candidate for the United States Senate, Royce White, who I believe, if the election were held today, would win the primary. I've seen nothing of substance from Joe Frazier's campaign that he's in a position to win the race. So my concern right now is this, is if Donald Trump is at the top of the ticket, and then in Minnesota, then we have an anti-Semite, someone who I think is not living in real world, as Royce White as the top of the ticket. It's going to be real hard for Republicans to make some gains. And I think I would be doing a disservice if I didn't take advantage of the fact that I was a homeless Republican and say something needs to change here quickly. Because Royce White is, I think, in a position to win the primary. And if he wins the primary and he's at the top of the ticket, you have Donald Trump and you have Royce White. Good luck, Republicans, picking up seats in the House. Good luck in the second congressional district, because Republicans can't win in this state within that type of environment. They simply can't. We've seen polling in other KSTP showing that Democrats are surging in the suburbs, a subject that we talked about. We've talked about how we've dedicated multiple podcast episodes talking about how Republicans can do better in the suburbs. And guess what, Republicans? You can't have people like Royce White at the top of your ticket and then have Donald Trump come into the state with JD Vance with the type of comments that he makes and think you're going to pick up seats in the state. It's simply not going to happen. And I think I think if I am really concerned, the presidential race, is certainly out of the control of me. The Senate race is out of the control of me, but I'm just going to say to you, my take is right now that Royce White wins the primary. The Frazier campaign has to do something to start stepping up their game, taking the fight to Royce White, and doing some type of activity that can mobilize Republicans to win. Because this race is, I think Minnesota Republicans are drastically letting this election cycle slip away. And we've talked about, and me, again, I'm someone who's not a Trump supporter. And I've tried to be as fair in my analysis as I can about him. But then you couple Royce White into this dynamic and you throw JD Vance's comments and where the state of the race is, this election cycle is slipping away from Republicans in Minnesota. And people better start taking it seriously because I think there's a distinct possibility come August 14th, the day after the primary, that Republicans are trying to pick up seats in the House with Donald Trump and JD Vance to the top of the ticket and Royce White as your US Senate candidate. And that's a nightmare scenario. It's impossible for Republicans to make any gains in that type of political environment. So if you're a Republican who wants to win in November, get off the sidelines regarding Royce White in the Senate race. Now is the time to speak up. Phrase your campaign, do something, get engaged, get active, show that there's some signs of life. Because I got to tell you something, I think I'm pretty good at handicapping races. And right now, I'd give the advantage to Royce White, and that should scare the living hell out of every normal Republican in this state.
Wow, I agree. I think it's really tough spot for us to be in because it is really tough to consider what the down ballot repercussions might be if people stay home, if they're just turned off from Republican politics for the foreseeable future. I think that there's been such an evolution within the party. You and I picture a snapshot of that because of our previous all in dedication and now not, because we are like so many that don't believe that the Republican Party and the candidates really represent our views and what we stand for and what we previously loved to champion and work for. And so it's hard to think about how do things turn around. Obviously, yes, Fraser winning the primary would be a great stepping stone, a great start to that, to take back and say that this is not the type of candidate, this is not who we stand for and what we support. But I personally think it's going to be a good number of years. It's going to be, if Trump's elected, at least 4 more years before we can take back the reins and maybe change this perception of what Republican politics can stand for and what the party is and who we represent. It's tough. It's sad. It's depressing. And the outlook is a little bleak. I am grateful for some of the individual state legislators and local candidates we do have. Unfortunately, they don't get the platform like some of these other candidates. And it's really, I agree with you. I still want to be optimistic that Republicans will take the House. I'm certainly not as optimistic as I was 6 months ago about it. So I'm with you. Please, if you have the capability to donate your time, your energy, your talents, whatever it might be, get involved, door knock. I know that there are a lot of hearing from some folks that are working on the ground. People need to hear. A lot of voters don't even know there's a primary election coming up. So please get out, share on social media, let people know, get out and vote in August.
And I will also say a dynamic that's really changed is Governor Walz. And feel free to load your ammo on me right now. But let me just say this to you. Where we were in this race, where we were a month ago is entirely different. And I put out a little take last night preview of what I was going to discuss, what I wanted to discuss about the state of the race, particularly Walz's standing. I don't know if Walz is going to be picked as the VP to be a running mate of Vice President Harris. I can see pros and cons in each way. And I have tried to offer, I think, objective analysis of why I think Walz could be viewed as a national figure outside of the state of Minnesota. All politics is local. And I think sometimes when I think familiarity in some ways breeds contempt, Walz is around here more. But I think just looking at politics as someone from another state would and looking through those factors, I think Walz is clearly in the mix. And I think Republicans should pause and think about that for a second. In 2012, Minnesota had two candidates running for president from the Republican side. We had Tim Pawlenty and Michelle Bachmann. And now here's where we are. Where are we right now? Right now, we are what, 12 years later? 12 years later, and right now, we have Governor Tim Walz in the running in, I think, probably in fair to say 1, 2, or 3 of being the VP selection and being selected by Vice President Kamala Harris to be the running mate. Independent of whether Tim Walz gets selected or not, I think he has come through this process in an amazing way. First of all, he's done nothing to hurt his chances. He's been value added to the Democrats. He has come up with this kind of phrase of the Republican candidates being weird. And let's talk about weird for a second. I did an interview this morning with someone on the weird comments. And my statement is that negative politics works. I would, anytime I go to schools or classrooms, college or elementary or anywhere in between, I always say that negative politics works. It's because why people ask, why is politics so negative? I always say, because negative politics works. I got a funny story for you. When I was getting married, and I was getting married at a church in Iowa, and the priest who was overseeing the marriage was in the middle of the ceremony was doing some off script remarks. He said, Michael, he goes, you work in politics. How do you win in politics? And the answer he was looking for was to have a plan. What I said, because that's what he said, in a marriage, you should have a plan and you got to work together. You know what I said in front of the entire church? Negative ads. Negative. In front of my family, my wife's family, an entire church in Petersburg, Iowa. I said, negative ads. That was my response. And
everyone's on video somewhere.
It's not, I think it is on video somewhere, but that was my answer. And because that's true. And he was looking for the answer plan, but it's negative. Negative politics works. And so the best kind of negative politics are the ones that kind of make you smile a little bit. And everybody knows someone that's weird. And that's the type of remark that hits. And Tim Walz has already been value added. Even if he doesn't get picked as VP, he's already been value added to the Democratic Party in this process. If Kamala Harris wins, I think Tim Walz is, if he's not picked to be the VP, I think he absolutely will be a part of the cabinet. And there's a distinct likelihood that he is recruited to leave Minnesota to be part of the Harris administration, independent of him being a VP. But what Walz and the Democrats have accomplished here in Minnesota has been simply astounding. Walz has helped Minnesota Democrats unite around Harris. And I think it's fundamentally taken Minnesota off the map. Not only has I think it taken Minnesota off the map, but they have coalesced in such teamwork that I think the Republicans' ability to divide the Democrats in Minnesota is much more difficult. And I think he's been incredibly value added to the Democrats as they prepare for the Democratic National Convention. He's been incredibly powerful, an advocate for the Harris ticket, and he's been very value added to the Republicans and messaging against. And Republicans have to recognize how that happened. Do you know how that happened, Minnesota Republicans? Because you nominated weirdos to run against him. That's why it happened. Tim Walz was created in Minnesota. And I have said very frequently, it's important to pick your friends, but it's also really important to pick your enemies. And in some ways, I think it's more important to pick your enemies. Tim Walz has had political enemies in this state that he has benefited immensely from. Remember, we had Scott Jensen on the podcast, and as much as we had a good discussion with him, let's remember what the Jensen Burke message was against Tim Walz. It was COVID masks were like Nazis, and a bunch of sexist remarks about women and comments about abortion and other types of stuff. Tim Walz succeeded in that environment. And that's been the type of message we have. Republicans in 2018 had a choice of nominating Jeff Johnson to run against Tim Walz, or they could have picked Tim Pawlenty. And those of you who decided that that a rerun of Jeff Johnson running in 2018 was better than a former sitting governor, great job. Because Tim Walz wasn't created in some laboratory somewhere. He is a political candidate who has risen to the national prominence in part because of the incompetence and the morons that have been running and trying to message against Tim Walz over the last few years. He has succeeded. And I think the Republicans' response to Walz being on the nomination list is just as feckless as their attacks against him. Tim Walz is successful today, in part because Tim Walz is a good politician, but because Republicans have been so incompetent in how they have messaged against him. Tim Walz decided to have lunches for every kid in this state. Legislative Democrats pushed it too. What was Republicans' response? To stand up and fight that type of stuff. Republicans have died on the wrong hills related to Tim Walz. And if anyone should be looking in the mirror as to why Minnesota is suddenly off the map for the Trump campaign, it's Minnesota Republicans. And Tim Walz, and let me just deal with me directly and just make this about me for just a second. I ran a website called Minnesota Democrats Exposed for a long time. I identify now with Tim, and I was the deputy chair of the party. I identify now more with Tim Walz than anything that existed with Jeff Johnson's campaign, when Scott Jensen's campaign. There's nothing that I identify related to that campaign. Tim Walz is normal in comparison to Jensen and Burke. They were weird. And Republicans in the state have to understand, rather than lampooning and making fun of me because I decided to endorse Tim Walz, maybe you should start trying to understand why Tim Walz, why I identify now more with Tim Walz, because there's a lot of people like me who used to be a part of this party that want this party to succeed, that believe that Tim Walz is a hell of a lot more normal than some of the Republicans that are running for office. And I'll give you a perfect example. How about Royce White? Because I got to tell you something. Royce White is, I think, is absolutely a racist, anti-Semite bigot. I think he is the worst candidate the Republicans have ever endorsed for statewide office in this state. And that says a lot based on who they've endorsed in the last few years. And there is literally no contest between if you're an average Minnesotan sitting by and saying, I could go with Tim Walz, or should I go with maybe the party that thinks Royce White is a good guy to back? That stuff matters. And I got to just say to you, Republicans have to wake up in the state, because I was someone who drove around this state, who lit dropped, who door knocked, who missed kids' events, family events, vacations, and other things to help this party out. And right now, I believe that the Democratic Party is more connected to Minnesota voters than anything that exists inside the Republican Party. And guess what? When you nominate and you endorse people like Royce White for the United States Senate, and you bring in Donald Trump, who lies about our elections, and when we get into the next subject, when you rally around J.D. Vance, who I thought was weird in 2022, and the party shouldn't have brought him in, and when you start to rally around people who make comments about women and cat ladies and how they shouldn't vote and all this type of stuff, this is why Republicans lose elections. This is exactly why Republicans lose elections. So, Republicans, you have gone from this being a contested political race here in Minnesota to this race being out, I think, right now out of reach for Republicans in this state. We have the Democratic governor of this state who, working with Minnesota Democrats, has united this state in a strong message. He is in the top tier to be picked to be Kamala Harris's running mate. And even if he isn't picked, I don't know what's better for Republicans. If Tim Walz leaves the state and becomes her running mate right away, or he stays here and is here in the election, because Republicans have a real problem, and that's Tim Walz. They created him in part because of how they've messaged against him. And rather than responding and looking at candidates like Scott Jensen and some of the other crazy positions that they've espoused, they should take a page out of Tim Walz's playbook, learn how to adapt, learn how to evolve, and try to win elections. Because Tim Walz is a lot of things. You know what he is? He's a winner. And that's the best way to shut up your critics, is to win. And Republicans can pound sand all they want. They can whine about this, whine about that, blah, 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 blah. What makes them mad about Tim Walz? He's been successful. And Republicans should quietly start analyzing why Tim Walz has been successful. Because the reason this state over the last few years has gone from an opportunity where we had two Republican candidates running for president out of the states and things were good, this state is on the cusp of being lost for Republicans for a very long time. Republicans have not won a statewide race since 2006. The last time a Republican endorsed candidate for United States Senate got more than 50% of the vote was in 1988, David Durenberger. The last time the Republican endorsed candidate for governor got more than 50% of the vote was 1978 in Al Quie. Republicans have not had a governing majority in terms of mandate from the voters on a statewide candidate in the longest time. And it's about time Republicans take stock in that. And so, in closing, if I may, when you got Donald Trump and J.D. Vance at the top of the ticket, and then right now, if the election were held today, you got Royce White ready to bring his racist hatred, his anti-Semitism, his bigoted views to the suburbs and all across the state. Republicans should not be surprised why they can't have nice things in the state. It's because of these types of decisions.
I completely agree. And I think it's I think the historical context is also important because this isn't just because of the MAGA movement, right? It's not just because of this new Trump. I think we can point to, we've had lots of conversations about the problems with the endorsement process and how it does tend to turn out further, sometimes more fringe candidates, a Royce White key problem of that. So I do think there's something to that. I also think it's this place where we are in where there's so many Republican voters and operatives that are turned off by the current situation that they've turned away from helping in these ways. I think with the Pawlenty and Frazier, I think that sometimes these candidates, I think, feel free to disagree, but think that normalcy and just being a normal, sane candidate is going to be enough to break through. And I think there are still major failures about both of those campaigns and how they were run, that they are not finding the success they should be. I think that Frazier had a lot of opportunity. When we talk to him, he seems like he should be able to step into that. I don't think that we've seen anything in terms of a robust, comprehensive, strategic campaign that would allow for that. And I don't know where that missing piece is. I don't know where that failure is, but I know there was a lot of frustration too. I love Governor Pawlenty. I supported him when he ran for president. I was not actively supporting anybody when he was running against Jeff Johnson because of my jobs, but would have liked him to be successful. There were certainly failures surrounding those campaigns, but I think to your point that when we talk a lot about the messaging, and I think we tend to be propping up or supporting some of these candidates who represent a further right wing of the party, but also, I don't know if it's some of it, I think, is willing negligence in the way they speak, and some of it's just ignorance, but can't get out of their own ways. And I think it's a really frustrating when we see all of these unforced errors come into play and play into the downfall of Republican policies and politics and candidates here in the state. And I do want to get more into that because we have two topics to talk about, some of the comments and the messaging and how that can get Republicans in trouble. But one thing I do want to, when we talk about Walz and how he's ascending through national politics in the state and obviously across the country, you went back to the archives this week and pulled out an episode from March or April of 2023. So we were still relatively new to this, but we were talking about an article that came out about about Walz on the national stage. And one of the comments that we chatted a little bit about is, what does Senator Amy Klobuchar think of this? And so I just wanted to circle back before we move on to the next topic, is because I agree with you. If Walz is not picked for VP, if Kamala Harris is elected, I do believe that is going to be having new job offers come to him. So I want to get just circle it back to that of what do you think that Klobuchar's take, being that she's constantly been on the short list of the Supreme Court and president and all of these different things. Do you think there's going to be any bad blood there in Democratic politics here in the state?
I don't think there will be. And I've listened to our comments before in the past, and I think it exists. At one point, again, going back to that episode, Hubert Humphrey was the vice president. Eugene McCarthy there was some challenges there. That all happened in the state of Minnesota. One thing I think people forget sometimes is the Democratic Party in Minnesota is called the DFL. It is the fusion of the Democratic and Farmer Labor Party. The Democrats in Minnesota are a coalitions-based party. They are much better at working together because of that unique and rich history have, the fusion of the farmer labor and the Democratic Party. So they're a coalitions-based party. I think there's absolutely enough opportunity for Senator Klobuchar to exist and for Governor Walz to exist on the national political landscape. I think ultimately the question shouldn't be and I'll say in response, I don't think there'll be bad blood. I don't think there'll be consternation. I think the lesson is, why is Minnesota is so in the bag for Democrats that they can launch here. This can be the proving ground for their policies so they can get plucked up nationally. That's what should frustrate Republicans more. I think that Klobuchar would have been a strong running mate for Joe Biden. Didn't have the podcast back then, but I was saying that back then. I understand why the choice was made, why Biden went the way that he did. But I think that I could see Klobuchar being, if Harris wins, I could see her being a candidate. I could see her being her attorney general. I could see Walz being a part of the administration if he's not the VP. There's ample opportunities. I think one of the things is that makes, I think, Klobuchar very attractive to being a part of the administration is two things. Number one, I think her record. Two, her seat is safe. It's not it's one of the factors that's going in about Kelly, Senator Kelly from Arizona being part of the pick is if Kelly's picked, can the Democrats hold that seat in 2 years? They can take Klobuchar off the table if she wanted to be a part of the administration. And it's almost a sure thing. The closest thing that can be a sure thing is that that the Democrats will hold this seat in Minnesota. And so I think Klobuchar is in a wonderful opportunity to reap the benefits from the Harris, whatever ticket that exists, if it's part of the administration. The other thing is that Senator Klobuchar is on autopilot to win re-election this election cycle. So that'll be her fourth term. My math is correct. I think that would be the start of her fourth term. The United States Senate is a seniority-based institution. I could see her staying in the Senate and being a part of the leadership of the Senate even more as it proceeds forward. She's in an incredibly safe seat, and she's got a lot of options. And so I think the Democrats are going to be able to handle that just fine.
Do you want to move on just to keep us going? But I think this is something that is a further conversation that I think we need to continue to have, as it's obviously not going away. And certainly as we see the primary in August, and should Bryce White be successful, we'll certainly have lots to say about that. I want to shift us to some troubling comments from President Trump. He was at a panel hosted by the National Association of Black Journalists. You sent me some links. I was doing dinner time with the kid last night. You sent me some links. And I think that, I guess, he showed up, so that's great. But they didn't take it easy on him, and they certainly held his feet to the fire on some past comments. But some new comments, I think, was a little bit more telling. Claimed at the panel last night, this week again at this event, that he did not know until a few years ago that Harris, who is Indian American and Black, was Black. He then suggested that she only decided to, quote, turn Black recently for political gain. So now these are some direct quotes from Trump. I've known her a long time indirectly, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I did not know she was Black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn Black, and now she wants to be known as Black. I respect either one, but obviously she doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she took a turn and she became Black. Somebody should look into that too. Is she Indian or is she Black? I'm almost a little speechless when I see and read and hear things like this, because again, are we living in a live episode of Beef? That this are truly comments that come out from a former sitting president, that we don't know enough about this time. Even if you don't agree with the understanding that a person is how they identify, that even if you don't buy in to the DEI way of corporate America or politics or any of that, even if that's all not something, how is this negligence? Is this his just truly ignorance, or is this Trump just trying to get attention? Or I don't even know what to attribute to this to, that he doesn't see him putting his foot in his mouth as he talks, and he continues to go and double down. It's, first of all, what does it matter? She is an Indian American. She is a Black woman. Those are both part of who she is and always has been. I think that, it's so frustrating. I just don't even know where to go here. Former President Donald Trump gets in his own way all the time. And it is the biggest frustration, because while I've been struggling with who I'm going to support, and I don't think I can cast my ballot to Kamala Harris, and as much as I want to leave the door open to former President Donald Trump, it's things like this that I just am so turned off about the Vance Trump ticket that I just can't get there. How are these men so ignorant in how they view large portions of our country and how they verbalize these things? What did he expect to win here? What was the goal? Was he just being just can you make any sense of this to me, of where Trump was hoping to get from that?
I think that Donald Trump knew exactly what he was doing. And what he was doing was this: he was energizing his white supporters by going into a room full of black journalists and sticking it to them. I don't think he was I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Donald Trump is a racist. I think he's a racist individual, and it's part of the reason I've never I'm more comfortable saying it because I think it was on full display yesterday. But I think Trump knew exactly what he was doing. He went into a room full of black journalists and he stood up and made absolutely racist statements. He was condescending, disrespectful towards the female journalists who were asking him questions. And I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think it is wrong of people to portray Donald Trump as some absent-minded uncle, your crazy uncle. Well, Donald Trump is your racist uncle. And I think what was on full display there, he was just direct about it. He went into an event hosted by black journalists, and he went in there and said to them that he didn't know, he had questions as to whether the sitting vice president of the United States, who is black, he then encouraged the journalists in that room at the National Association of Black Journalists to investigate and look into, quote, when she turned black. Now, he walked into that event and peddled race and engaged in bigotry and racism as sexism, which is Donald Trump's playing card. That's how he got here. Remember, he did that with Barack Obama. He led with the birther argument against Donald Trump. I mean, against Barack Obama. That was his foray into politics,
Mhm.
was to engage in that type of rhetoric, that type of racist, bigoted rhetoric. Now, I remember when I was deputy chair, I was asked by Pat Kessler if Donald Trump, I was asked if Barack Obama was born in this country. I said, of course he was. Of course he was legally qualified to be president. Didn't put any stock in this birther agenda that was being pushed by Donald Trump. And he's playing that same card. I don't think anyone should be surprised at what he did. I would think what is surprising about it is this. I think a number of people, including myself, were wondering how much the shooting had changed him. And would this be a different kind of race? And what you saw was a racist bigot go into an event of black journalists and just pour gasoline on the fire. He wasn't interested in trying to win over any of the people in the audience. You know who he was trying to win over? His white supporters by going into a hostile environment because that's the way he thinks. If he can leave a room, if he can leave a room with black journalists fighting and being in a disagreement, what dial does that turn? You know what helps out? It helps out his white base who think he was brave and he stuck it to them and he went into the belly of the beast and went in with the liberal media. Donald Trump is a peddler of race and he is a sexist bigot. And we saw it on stage yesterday. The way he spoke to those female journalists is how he speaks to journalists that he doesn't like. And he uses terms to put them down in ways that he wouldn't do other people. I don't know how many more times people need to see examples of this. I believe Donald Trump, at his heart, is a sexist. He's Mr. Hart from 9 to 5. He's a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. That's what I think he is. I've long described Donald Trump the way, and that was on full display yesterday. What I think was so ugly about what he did yesterday is because I think it's so transparent. Because if we're acting as if I think it's wrong of anyone to say, "Oh, he's the crazy uncle and he doesn't know what he's doing." That's what a lot of people are saying. And I understand that people may feel that way. And I think that some of the people who have that position want to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. And so I understand that they have that position. I have seen this play out for years. It's one of the reasons I've never liked Donald Trump. It's why I have never voted for Donald Trump because I believe he is exactly like Mr. Hart in 9 to 5. He's a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. And by the way, if you haven't seen 9 to 5, it's a fantastic movie. Dabney Coleman passed away earlier this year. God rest his soul. It's hands down one of my favorite movies. But that's exactly who he is. He's a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. And that's what you saw yesterday on stage. And so Donald Trump had an opportunity yesterday to go into that room and be presidential and talk about legitimate issues. But he went in there with his racist grenade, threw it in the room and left. And who's cheering right now? Who's out there excited about what he did yesterday? Who thinks he did a good job? Not many black people that I've seen on TV because I've been watching TV. As I do, I rotate through MSNBC, Fox News, CNN. And I've seen a number of, I don't think I've seen one analyst go out and say he did the right thing. And in fact, I saw a number of African American Black Republican strategists going out there and saying this was terrible. And at
Mhm.
some point, I'm not going to get gaslit anymore by what I saw on TV. I saw a racist go into a room with Black journalists. I saw him treat women horribly. And I heard him peddle the same racist, bigoted theories that he's peddled for years. And you know what's really sad, Becky? Is because after Donald Trump did it, guess what Royce White, with the Republican endorsement behind his back, did last night? He went and did a podcast last night and he doubled down on the rhetoric. And that guy's doing it with the Republican endorsement behind him. And so Royce White and Donald Trump, even though Royce White has endorsed, even though I think Royce White said he supported Biden at some point, and I believe he also has endorsed RFK in this race, that's the type of candidate we have on the Republican side of the United States Senate. They'll see racist behavior being done, and he'll embrace it and wrap himself around the flag. That's why Donald Trump is a bad candidate. And that's why Royce White is a candidate. And Republicans need to stop this stuff. And I think we also have to stop sugarcoating this stuff. It was racist bigotry, sexism on display. And I think every Republican should be speaking out against it. And I know that there's limitations on what folks will do. They're going to try to spin it and couch it as all these other things. Donald Trump is exactly who I thought he was. He is a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. And yesterday was another example of it.
All right. I don't think we need to say anything else on that. Wrap that up in a nice little bow. We have some other ridiculous comments to get into. Again, I wanted to like JD Vance. I didn't know a ton about him. I wanted to be optimistic of some of his efforts working across the aisle and some of the more independent thinking and thoughts and comments he's had. Obviously, as more comes out, and it's not good for JD Vance or the Trump ticket. So this largely stems from original comments back in 2021 where he had comments about questioning why some of the leading politicians did not have children. He used Kamala Harris as an example, again, back in 2021. Some of his quotes were, "The entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. How does it make any sense? We've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it." He said the country was being run by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made. And so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. He tried to couch some of the comments saying having kids makes you a better person. And then goes into the fact that so many people, especially in America's leadership class, don't have that in their lives. I worry that it makes people more sociopathic and ultimately our whole country a little bit less mentally stable. When this came out, he tried to apologize more to cats than to childless women. He said this is about criticizing the Democratic Party for becoming anti-family and anti-children. I wish when talked about the Kamala Harris, I wish her and her stepchildren, her whole family, the very best. The point is not that she's lesser. The point is that her party has pursued a set of policies are profoundly anti-child. When you're explaining, you're losing. When these comments came out, were my lady friends really fired up. This came across my entire social feed from folks who never post about politics to folks who do. So first, having children does not mean you have more value than any other person. I love being a mother. I am so proud. It's the best thing I've ever done. And I've always known that I want to have kids. That's not the choice or path for everybody. Yeah, I can get into some of my friends too, but let's chat about some childless women. Some women do not have kids because they want to travel or have high career aspirations. Some women choose not to have kids because they simply are not maternal or that just is not what they want their life to look like. And other women don't have kids because they cannot. And that's devastating and makes me want to cry because I know women who fall into that category and it's awful. And to tell these women that the only true value that they bring to society as hardworking, tax-paying contributors to our society, to diminish their existence to the ability to bear and raise children is insane. Like absolutely asinine. Let's start with the fact that men cannot have children. Yes, you help produce children, but you do not put yourself through the 10-month pregnancy, subsequent hormone difficulties that follow. And when I was reading, because again, this was across the TikToks everywhere, a CNN panel had an author, Liz Plank, on, and her reaction was, her commentary was just spot on. We don't question the contribution of men in our society because they don't give birth, and so we shouldn't be doing that for women. For JD Vance to denigrate an entire group of women based on an arbitrary skill that he doesn't even have is embarrassing. It is so wild. Women are CEOs, women are doctors, they're teachers, they're paramedics, they are union workers, they are doing things and working and contributing to our society. They are working in nonprofits and churches. They are helping raise children, whether their own or others. They are helping to do so much in our society, obviously, just as men are. And to say that a woman being a mother is the only way they can bring value to this society is just, it makes my blood boil quite a bit. And it makes me super, super frustrated for what this tells young women and young men, because I think that there is a lot of pressure on women in particular to have children and have subsequent children and to do that. And I am so grateful that I had so much support when I wanted to spend a decade hardcore in my career and working 12, 14, 16-hour days, things that I would not have been able to do had I had a child at that time or had a family. I'm so super grateful that I had that support. And it just makes me sad to think that this makes some women feel that they are less than. I have some great women in my life. I was just recently at my 20-year high school reunion, and the number of folks there that do not have children and have no desire or plans to have children is just very different than it was a decade or 2 decades ago, and certainly from our parents' generation. And I think that's a wonderful choice that women get to have these days. Whether it's because you want to sit and scroll on your phone or travel the world, whether it's because you have a job, a minimum wage job, or you're a CEO of a company, that's your choice. And I think the biggest issue that I really have with this is it allows the Democrats to continue to perpetuate the narrative, which I sometimes agree with, that the Republican Party is not just pro-life or pro-birth. Republicans don't support the children and the families after that, right? They want all this. It allows the Democrats to be successful in saying Republicans want you to give birth and then figure it out. They're not going to give you paid family leave. They're not going to help your children get food for lunches. That's the Democrats that are doing that. Republicans don't care. And while I don't necessarily agree with that, because I know Republicans are compassionate and caring and we're never going to win that argument, the policies that Republicans have been pushing do allow the Democrats to win on that. And I think it's really frustrating when we look at this in the abortion topics and all of these subsequent policy changes that the Democrats are pushing, and Republicans are just sitting here saying, you got to keep pumping up kids. I that was a little bit of a word salad and all over the map, but this really fired me up and made me really sad. And I don't think that they've done a subsequent job of apologizing in an appropriate manner. Women are an incredible voting bloc, have become more vocal and more active over the last few years, few decades. And I think this is the type of thing that really can hurt up and down the ticket.
When I heard this comment, two things came into my mind right away. First of all, our conversations, because I have appreciated so much our discussions and how you have voiced that this be a topic that we discuss, that we create this type of space where we continually go back to this. And I was so disappointed by what he said. First of all, I've never been a fan of JD Vance. And for those that can scroll through my Twitter history, JD Vance was selected to be, when he was a candidate in the state of Ohio, he was selected to be the featured speaker at the Lincoln Reagan dinner. And a number of us spoke out and said, JD Vance should be coming to Minnesota because of his statements he made on the Ukraine. So I've long been of the position that JD Vance is a little off, maybe say weird. And I think that his comments that he made here completely validate my conception, my beliefs, my preconceived beliefs about what type of person he would be. I'm not surprised by this at all. Now, we have a podcast. We like to give people an opportunity to speak. We've had people on talking about JD Vance, but now that it's just you and I can say it, I think JD Vance was weird long before this. These are horrific comments. I thought about two things right away. First of all, I thought about our discussions. Then I also thought about my sister-in-law, who is One of my favorite people in my life. My sister-in-law is just delightful. She's not married. She doesn't have kids. The sister-in-law that I'm speaking to knows exactly. I'm not going to embarrass her by saying her name. But my sister-in-law is just a joy. She is an aunt to my children. She is a sister to my wife, and she is just wonderful. I love spending time with her, although she and I can bicker like old friends, but she is a delightful person. And I thought to myself, my God, how sad that she gets cast in this type of way. I don't know the reasons as to why she has not had children. But what I know is that my sister in law is smart and capable. She is an executive. She is a teacher. She teaches at courses. She is strong. She is independent. And she has everything right in this election cycle to vote any way she wants and speak up the way that she wants. And for some United States senator from the state of Ohio to diminish her standing because she didn't have children just pisses me off. And I think it's sad. And it's the exact type of hatred and division that we have seen Republicans engage in. I think JD Vance is everything I thought he was in 22 and even worse. I like him less now than I liked him before, and I didn't like him that much to begin with. I think he's sexist. I think he believes that that women in society have one role. And to think that my sister-in-law should be diminished because of the successes that she's had in her life and that her successes only have to be defined by having children, that's a preposterous statement. That's a preposterous statement. And it's something that we have talked about before. It's just sad. And I can't imagine all the women out there that how they feel when they hear that type of comment. And again, this is where Republicans lose women. Okay? Because when it comes down to choice, the choice that Republicans are offering women is have kids. Have kids, and that's it. But you're going to make that the process by which they do that as difficult as possible in some ways. You're going to force them, if they become pregnant, to risk their life in a situation, to maybe travel across state lines in order to deal with a medical emergency that they have. That's what JD Vance is offering in this country. That's what Donald Trump is offering. And I can't imagine how you felt when you heard those statements. But I know how I felt. And I immediately thought about our discussion and I thought about my sister in law, who is just a delightful person. She's a pain in the ass sometimes to me, and we love to bicker and we love to fight and we have some disagreements. But to think that her only standing in the eyes of JD Vance, she only has a say because of whether she's had a child is simply ridiculous. My sister-in-law, I think, is a hell of a lot more successful than JD Vance. Let me just also say, I don't think women should, this is a comment that was directed towards women. I think men should be pissed off about this. I'm pissed off about it, but I feel bad because who he targeted and who he diminished. And I'm tired of sitting by quietly as Republicans single out people, target and win elections on the back of rather than lifting them up. Let me tell you something, Becky. I was not going to vote for Trump and Vance. I had not disclosed how I was going to vote this election cycle, and I'm not ready to yet. But I will tell you that my position has changed on what I was going to do. And I'm happy to discuss it in the coming weeks. But my position has changed. And you want to know why it's changed? Is because I think Donald Trump is a racist. And I was waiting to, and first of all, I was never going to vote for Donald Trump. Never going to vote for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump is peddling the same racism that he did before. He's now got a sidekick from Ohio in JD Vance, just disastrous Vance, as I like to call him. Just disastrous Vance is what JD stands for. Someone also said DJ Vance. I've been stealing that from him and using DJ Vance, but I'm now going with JD Vance of just disastrous Vance. He's now got a sidekick because Donald Trump is throwing out the racist barbs, the bigoted barbs, and the sexist barbs. But now we got JD Vance coming in and targeting women. And I think it's a disastrous ticket. They should lose. And I think that they are going to lose this election cycle. And in many ways, I hope they do. Because I think there are people in my family and people in my life that are going to prosper and develop a hell of a lot better under a Harris ticket and whoever VP pick is than anything that will happen under Trump and Vance.
My last real comments here is I think that I see a lot of folk wanting us to to take personalities aside and focus on the policies. So to focus on the Trump-Vance policies, to focus on the Harris potential VP policies. And in general, I do like to do that. But here is where I'm starting to struggle because we've talked a lot about how elected officials should be held to a higher standard, and folks look to them as a little bit of a beacon of how we can and should act. And in these last two conversations, I get worried about what this means for children being raised and seeing this and thinking these things are acceptable ways to communicate with each other, acceptable things that other people are forcing or saying about them. And I think it's just really tough to think about. We still have a lot of ways to go for women in this world. This is the first Olympics where there's like a little daycare nursing room for Olympic athletes, many of whom are mothers. That's insane. It's 2024. It's just like we talked about with Senator Erin McQuaid. It's 2024. And yes, we have made strides, and in particular over the last decade, but we are not equal, and there are still a lot of different things we need to do to have women be able to be looked at and not have conversations about where you're having your next kid, and are you a daughter or assistant, or where are your kids when you're on the road traveling, or all of these different things that women get asked that working fathers do not get asked. And so that's where my current internal struggles are, is that I want to take policy or the personalities out and look at the politics of what individual tickets will do to the future of our country and for where I want to raise my kid. But it's getting really tough to do that when I feel like it really is such a big role of also what the future looks like for our children based on these sort of comments being acceptable on race and on gender and sexuality and all sorts of different things that some of both Donald Trump and JD Vance and Royce White and other Republicans do. So it's a tough time to be a wannabe Republican diehard, and I'm struggling with it. Yes, go for it.
Can I ask you a question? Because I thought Mark, when we had that episode with Mark Drake, and he was talking about Democrats kind of being on a little bit of a sugar high, talking about the right track, wrong track of where this is. Here's what I think is so interesting is, and I'd like to pose this question to you. Mark's point was that most people feel, and at that point, I don't know where the right track, wrong track is now, but he was saying, look, what people should be talking about is the right track, wrong track of where this country is going. And his argument was that there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about Kamala Harris that he was describing as a bit of a sugar high, because the reality of the race was that most Americans at that time believed we were headed in the wrong direction. So I guess my question I'd like to ask you is this. I know you're a smart operative, and at one point I was a smart operative. But if you were in a race where the trajectory of the race was that you were on the side, you were working against the incumbent, and that most people thought in your state or in the country was you were going in the wrong direction, why would you make the race, why would you make the election about the gender and race of someone? Why would you not discuss about policy? Can I ask you that question? Because I think what's interesting is that in a lot of the commentary last night about Trump's comments, Republicans were saying, look, he shouldn't be talking about this type of stuff. He should be talking about policy related matters. My question to you is, why does it always get to this with some Republican candidates? Why do Republicans want to make it about race and gender and the role of women in particular? And they don't want to get into policy.
I think that in this situation, like President Trump, like physically can't help himself. I think that if we took from the RNC convention through the end of the year and he kept his head down and he focused on the failures of the Biden Harris administration and that they're the reason that gas prices are up 58% and grocery prices are up 25% and rent is up and everything in our life is more expensive, yet not getting better. If they sat there and focused about on the issues at the border and how Kamala was supposed to be the immigration czar and she is largely responsible for what is going on in the continued legislation that will make that problem better than just sticking a band-aid. If they sat and focused on those issues, I do truly think that the Republicans would win in November. I think that it's these things that is completely derailing, and it's taking a huge chunk of voters, maybe not a huge chunk of voters, but enough voters that are either going to stay home, vote for RFK, vote for Biden, I'm sorry, vote for Harris. Um, because I really think if we look at the issues, and that's where I might struggle, it's the head versus the heart here. It is, I think if we look at the issues and hammered Harris and the Democrats on all of the failures of the COVID and the shutdown in the economy and everything that's going on, and we're less safe, our education system is messed up, we have all of these failures that we can point and we can hand over to them if we simply remind folks of the San Francisco liberal elite that Kamala Harris is, I think they would be successful. I don't think that Trump can help himself. I don't think he has, I don't think he wants to help himself. I don't think he wants to, that's just not who he is. And I think that on campaigns that I've been on, that's a question you typically ask up front, and one that I like to have a conversation with candidates about is message discipline, because you see it make and break campaigns all the time from rogue comments. I've been on campaigns where I would say a couple of rogue comments have derailed their election. And in this situation, I don't think there's enough message discipline in the world that could keep Trump from saying how he truly feels. And again, to not give him credit, but to understand a little bit, it's because there is a base that is accepting of it, right? He's not saying these things in a vacuum. He's not throwing it up against the wall and hoping it's because he knows that there is a base of folks that believe these things. There is a base of folks who don't believe in that people can identify with who they are, and they want to tamp down and keep everything in a nice little box. And there's two genders, and there's X races, and there's all of these different things that they think they can define up folks so easily. And that there's just a base, there's an environment that allows it and accepts it and welcomes it and gives a big hug around these comments and cheers them on. And so he feels vindicated and he feels okay with it, regardless of what the press is saying, because it's the press and they hate me and they're just going to go against me regardless.
That's a great answer. You know why I think he can't do it? Because he's a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. That's why. And I think to him, let me say this too. I'd like to just close out with just a couple rapid fire questions quick. I'm very curious if there's going to be a debate, because I think that Trump does not know how to run and message against Kamala Harris. And so I'd be curious if they debate. I'd like to get your take as to whether there's going to be a debate.
I think there needs to be a debate. I think there's going to be a big push to be a debate. I don't know that I wouldn't blame either side from saying they don't want to debate. I very firmly believe, like I said earlier, that I think the Trump campaign and President Trump himself are struggling to figure out what that messaging footing looks like for them. I don't think that they found the winner. I believe they're probably doing a whole hell of a lot of message testing to try to figure that out. I think that the last debate showed us that we should have debate, but obviously it burned both candidates, right? As much as we argued for Biden getting out, probably wasn't the best thing for the Trump campaign. Do we want to give Kamala Harris the opportunity to do a word salad, or do we want to give her the opportunity to articulate how she is going to be the next leader of the free world? I don't know what the Trump debate or Trump side is viewing that. I would lean towards President Trump probably pushing more for a debate than the Harris team. So I don't know. What do you think? There's going to be another one?
I think there will be another debate. I do think there'll be a debate, but I think it's going to be very challenging. I would also ask you, I think there will be a debate. So you think there'll be a debate? I think there'll be a debate. One other quick rapid fire question. Do you think that if they could do it all over again, they'd still pick JD Vance? No.
I'm starting to see that. I don't think so. I think if they could go back, I don't think that he's going to drop him. I don't think he's going to do anything of that sort. I think this is really showing what green candidates and not properly vetted individuals who have been in this sort of environment. He's brand spanking new, right? He's been in the Senate for 2 years, not even 2 full years, or what? None of them. But anyways, he's so untested. He's so unknown, and it has been far more trouble than it is worth. I think that he could have instilled ways of having an heir to the mega fortune in some other way.
Okay. Yes, I think that they, in retrospect, they would have picked somebody else. And I think Nikki Haley would have been a better option. I think that Nikki Haley would have been a better option, I think, for Trump.
Mm.
I still would not have, if Nikki Haley would have been picked to be Trump's running mate, I still wouldn't have voted for Trump, even though I voted for Nikki Haley in the presidential primary here in Minnesota. I still wouldn't have voted for Trump because I agree with him that you vote on the front of the ticket. Becky, I so greatly appreciate you allowing us to have this discussion today. It was strong and it was going to be one of our spicier episodes, I think. And I really
Yeah.
appreciate the discussion, you being so candid, you pushing back, and also just creating the space because I think this is going to be a great episode for our listeners. And I really appreciate doing this with you.
Absolutely. Thank you as well. I thank God the legislative session is not in right now because there's too much going on the national stage. But I'm sure we'll have some more hot topics, Minnesota related, in the future. And who knows, we might be coming back with another bonus episode in days, weeks, announcing Walz as VP. So stay
Oh,
tuned.
oh yes, I would say I think it's going to be before month. I think it's going to be the next couple days.
Yeah, me too.
A last question then: who's it going to be? You think?
I still think Kelly. I'm a little bit closer to Walz being the top. I think it's a Kelly Walz. I don't think it's Shapiro.
I think it's. I'm going to go with Walz. I'm going to go with Walz Shapiro. I think Kelly's fallen off a bit, but we'll see. All
All
right.
right.
Thank you for doing this, Becky. We'll talk soon. We want to thank you for listening to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you for listening.